At the start of round 4 of the Gashimov Memorial Tournament, Magnus Carlsen was leading by a clear point. Today he faced Fabiano Caruana. Now, they've played many times before, most recently in the Zurich tournament, where Carlsen won a very nice game. But there he had the white pieces. Today Carlsen had black. Let's see how the game went. Caruana hasn't always been an easy opponent for Carlsen. They've had some good tussles in the past, and Caruana has had a couple of victories, although Carlsen definitely has a plus score against him. Now, today we had the Berlin defence, and Caruana played into this very well-known endgame. Let's just skip through these first few moves. There are many ways that white can play this, likewise black. It's not exactly clear what the best strategy is for both players. But that, of course, is why the opening, at least among the elite level, is very popular, because it's very hard to prepare against the Berlin. Nevertheless, the position we have on the board after bishop f4, rook d8 has been seen before, actually in one of Caruana's games. Previously, Caruana had this position against Ponomaryov, and there he played e6. And they traded pawns, but this wasn't really quite enough, and Caruana didn't get much advantage with white. Today he played something different. He played knight e4, which looks like a very standard move. The knight moves into a good square in the centre of the board. Bishop e7 played by Carlsen. Remember that black can't actually castle in this position. That would solve all black's problems. The king has already moved when it recaptured the queen, and this is black's big problem in this position. There's no connection between the rooks, whereas white's pieces are well placed. Now, white's only problem is that this pawn sometimes gets in the way of his pieces and gives black some control, because he controls these two light squares. But okay, now we see one of white's big ideas in this variation is to advance the kingside pawn majority, this 4-3 majority, and the knight had to go to h4. And Caruana is just playing with small steps, just gradually creeping up the board. This is best strategy for white. You can't really rush it. Bishop e6. Offering an exchange of rooks, which this would help black, because after this, then it's going to be much easier to get the rook on h8 into the game after perhaps king c8 and rook d8, or maybe king e7 and rook d8. So white waits with f3. And now, okay, king e7 is the normal move to protect the rooks, but it's clear that Carlsen was reluctant to play this very obvious move. Well, why was he reluctant? The problem is that the bishop doesn't have a retreat now to e7, so that after bishop g3, black will be forced to exchange these bishops, and that certainly is progress for white. Now, you can recapture either way, but let's say king takes. Carlsen obviously didn't like this, because exchanging the pair of bishops off is a plus for white. But this is probably the best way for black to play. Now, black is a bit worse here, but you know, after a move like rook d5, maybe it's not so bad. Instead, he chose the plan to put his pawn on c5. Caruana played b3 and c4 to take d5 under control. That's a good idea. And Carlsen did this because he wants to control d4, but you know, if the rook comes to d4, then this can always be pushed away with the bishop. Well, Carlsen played rook d7. He could still go for the position after with king e7. But his idea was to retain the bishop pair. So after bishop g3, he played his bishop back to e7, keeping the bishop pair. Caruana exchanged off rooks and now played an excellent move, knight c3. You'll notice how careful Caruana has been in keeping his king well protected. So he hasn't advanced the f-pawn too early. That would have opened this diagonal, and the king would have some difficulties. Also, keeping the pawns like this means that h5 doesn't really have any effect. This pawn on g4 would be solid enough and it's protected by the other two pawns. But knight c3 is an excellent move. Now we see the downside to playing c5. It's actually weakened the d5 square. Now, black could protect the square with c6. The problem is this rather blocks in the bishop. It also weakens the d6 square. So, well, let's see. After a4, and with the idea of a5, so black blocks, and then knight e4, you can see this is an unpleasant position for black because the knight has bounced back and can come into d6, and black has very little counterplay in this position. Carlsen played king d8. Knight d5, good square for the knight, and then rook d1. And Carlsen should compromise and play c6 and play this endgame. But, I mean, it's clear that this is better for white. No doubt about it. I mean, he was reluctant to do that, giving away this d6 square and no counterplay on the queen side. Instead, he played king c8, and he had completely overlooked that Caruana could take on c7. Dreadful blunder from Carlsen. So if king takes knight, then the pawn checks, or at least the bishop checks, I should say, so it's a discovered check, and black is just utterly lost here. If the king comes forward, you take here, threatening mate and rook's pawn. It's dreadful. So Carlsen just had to move the rook to the side, and the knight just came back to d5. Now it's completely secure on that square. White is a pawn up for nothing. So now it is, as they say, a matter of technique for white. But this is still not simple. Let's see how Caruana did it. Now, the obvious way to play would be just to advance the pawns, but this is not simple. The king has to step out of this pin, and yeah, it's not easy for white to break through with the pawns. I really like this next move from Caruana. He played his bishop back to e1 and round to c3. And that gave his king some room, rather. And you can see it's much more secure when it comes to advancing with f4. But notice again, he's not in a hurry. I think this is one of the great lessons of technique, that it's all about controlling the position and squashing your opponent's counterplay before moving forward. Now, Carlsen didn't want to wait. He lashed out with b5, hoping to improve the situation for his bishops, which he does with b5, but the problem is this also leaves a weak pawn on c5. And the c4 square is sometimes available for this knight. Again, very nicely played from Caruana, just keeping everything under control. Now it's time to advance. So Carlsen is thrashing around with his rook. I mean, one of the reasons that Carlsen played like this was that Caruana was running a little bit short of time, but he kept everything under control. You know, he wasn't tempted to lash out with a4, which would have left potentially the b3 pawn slightly weak, you know, after moves like this come. But no, he just very restrained. Rook d2, this is excellent chess. So Carlsen is trying to find something to bite on here, and again he's lashing out with h5. Probably not a very good move, but when short of time it's not easy to control moves like this. But again, excellently played from Caruana. The knight comes to a beautiful square looking at d6. Carlsen checked, so he's looking to somehow get something against the king. King h2, very good move. If he'd gone the other way to f2, then this is getting a little bit problematic. You know, maybe the rook can swing down. But king h2, the rook covers along the second rank. Very good from Caruana. Anyway, bishop c6 and now knight d6 check. Be tempting to take that pawn, but suddenly the bishops come in, and in combination with the other two pieces, this is already a little dangerous. Excellent move from Caruana, driving the rook back and then just cutting this bishop out of the game. Very nicely played. Bishop e6. Now this is the last move of the time control. Caruana had maybe a minute or so to play his last move. He didn't risk taking this pawn, but instead dropped the knight back to c4. Well, it's a pragmatic move, probably a good decision. Couldn't work out what was happening after knight takes pawn, but this just keeps this bishop under control. Now if Carlsen played bishop c7, there's still some work to do for white. Probably white would exchange off bishops, but it's still not easy. Instead, Carlsen played rook e8, and that allowed Caruana to repeat the position. If the rook defends the pawn, then you can just play here, and well, white steams forward. So Carlsen repeated the position, and this time Caruana thought, well, for over 20 minutes before plunging in for this capture on f7. So he's 2 pawns up, but he had to calculate this tricky move. Bishop g1 mate is threatened. You can see the power of the 2 bishops and the rook combining together, but Caruana had worked out that actually his king is safe on h3. Still not simple. Carlsen was thrashing around, trying to make something in this position. Bishop e3 threatens again something with bishop f4 with these bishops, but Caruana had it worked out. Bishop e5 check, covering the diagonal towards the king. And now it's white's turn. And bishop g3 cuts out any nonsense with the rook. Still, Carlsen was battling c3. The pawn wants to go home, but again, Caruana had it all worked out. And now this move, rook c8. If the pawn advances, of course, you take the bishop with check and then take the pawn. Now there's a tricky move. What about rook c4? Cutting off white's rook. So it seems as though it's not possible to prevent black making a queen. In fact, white is winning after this move. If the bishop blocks, then bishop f4 covers. If the king comes back, then this is a forced checkmate. And if the king goes forward, then this is actually checkmate again. Okay, back to the game. So after rook c8, hitting the bishop moved, but now white breathes a sigh of relief, takes that dangerous pawn off, and now it's just a case of mopping up. Black can't hold everything together here. There are too many tactics. The bishops are badly placed now, and well, Carlsen was still fighting like crazy, but Caruana had it under control. If bishop takes e6, then that wins material. There's a fork and the rook is overloaded, and after rook takes pawn, knight g5, Carlsen finally resigned. The rook is threatened, the bishop is threatened. So for example, if rook takes pawn, rook takes bishop, and white is a piece up, and this time for absolutely nothing. So Caruana wins. Really great victory by him. I think he showed excellent calculation in this final phase. He showed excellent technique in controlling Carlsen's play, And first of all, I think very good opening preparation to put Carlsen under a lot of pressure. And the man cracked. Afterwards, Carlsen said, "It's unpleasant to lose, but to be honest, my mind has been pretty indifferent all day. Well done to him," to Caruana. "I need to regroup and find some energy. And then I'll rest on the free day." Yeah, Magnus Carlsen has had 4 really tough, long games, and even for someone as fit and as well prepared as him physically, it's really tough, and I think that showed today. But great victory from Caruana. Remember, he's only 21 years old. He's younger than Carlsen, who's 23. So the standings after 4 rounds, Carlsen and Caruana are on 2.5 points. Karyakin, Radyabov and Nakamura on 2, Mamedyarov on 1. The other 2 games were drawn today. Actually, they were quite interesting, but I'm afraid not enough time to go through those games.